We interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast.
Men and women of the United States, this is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe. The men of General Dwight Eisenhower are leaving their landing barges, fighting their way up the beaches into the fortress of Nazi Europe. The world's greatest military undertaking is underway.
The most important day of World War II, perhaps of the 20th century, D-Day. I'm Jane Pauley, and this is Time and Again.
The following program is brought to you in living color. Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you.
This is Lowell Thomas in New York. The Beatles emerged on the
And go, my fellow Americans!
I'm Chet Huntley, your host on...
We had 73 television cameras on May Day Girl.
President Nixon is actively...
One small step for man.
Hello and welcome to Time and Again. World War II lasted for 6 years, but in all that time, no day had greater consequence than D-Day, June 6, 1944, when thousands of Allies crossed the English Channel to France into the teeth of entrenched Nazi opposition. To be on the beaches of Normandy that day was to be in the most dangerous place on earth. Success would mean a chance of finishing off Adolf Hitler, one of the most barbaric dictators in human history. Failure? Well, failure was unthinkable. The invasion could have failed, but it did not. A tribute to the Allies' meticulous planning, and above all, the unselfish heroism of all who took part. Thousands died that day in the name of freedom. We remember them and those who survived on this episode of Time and Again.
I'll see you on the beach.
This may be the best approximation we have today of what D-Day was like. The stunning opening sequence of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. But those who were there say no movie can capture the reality, the chaos, the terror, the almost unbelievable acts of courage. Let's go to the beaches of Normandy now. Here's Tom Brokaw.
They're serene now, those beaches that were awash with agony and death. Sword Beach, Juneau, Utah, Omaha. The towns are restored. Sainte-Mère-Église here, as well as Saint-Lô, Caen, Bayeux, historic markers on the road to the destruction of Adolf Hitler's Fortress Europa. June 1944. The Germans were in trouble. Their war machine was short of fuel. The Allied air forces that destroyed fuel lines effectively destroyed the German Air Force as well. Hitler and his generals knew the cross-channel attack was coming. They knew the Allies had a vast army of men and equipment on the roads and fields of England. There were 1,700,000 Americans in Britain, sharing candy with children, romancing the young women. They were so young, teenagers and barely older, their age of innocence about to come to an end. What they came up against was a defense organized by one of the best military minds of the time. The Atlantic Wall of artillery, machine gun nests, mines, and tank traps designed by Rommel. Rommel was not a Hitler favorite. He was regular army, not a Nazi. But Rommel was more respectful of Hitler than the regular Western Zone commander, Field Marshal Gerrit von Rundstedt. The bad feeling between Hitler's high command and the generals at the front crippled Germany's performance on D-Day and the fighting that followed. The Allied high command had its own collection of full-blown egos. They were held together by the man from the Kansas prairie, Dwight Eisenhower. Ike's energy, good nature, and military mind provided a common bond. And Ike was enormously popular with the GIs. NBC's Merrill Miller was with the general as he visited the airborne troops.
Where are you from, General Ike would ask one boy. What did you do in civilian life? How old are you? Are you a good shot with that rifle? And invariably, off in another corner of the field, the men would start shouting for Ike. And over he'd go, giving them the impression that this general was just one of the guys who thought they were the best soldiers in the world.
The weather was terrible those first days of June 1944, so fierce that the Germans were sure that the Allies would not, could not invade. Rommel returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. He was taking her a pair of shoes made in Paris. Then the Allied forecaster saw the possibility of a slight break in the storm, and Ike gave the go-ahead. "I don't like it, but here it is," he said. "I don't see how we can do anything else." The invasion was launched. D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
There had never been anything like the invasion fleet. More than 5,000 ships of every description, 200,000 men of 9 Allied nations, 15,000 planes providing support and escort. Correspondent James Wellen flew over the Armada.
Ships were moving from the coast of England in immense convoys. In some convoys, the ships were sailing in single file. In others, they were in various patterns. I could see hundreds of planes crossing and crisscrossing below us.
The Air Force saturated the target area with bombs. The German shore units took a heavy pounding. So did the French villages and countryside. Then it was time for the first units, the Pathfinders, the paratroopers, the glider units. Wright Bryan of the Atlanta Journal and NBC station WSB was with the first wave of troopers.
As we headed toward the coast, the bulky transports silhouetted against the skies, they gently undulated in the pop wash of their companions. The jump light blinked as the pilot threw his switch, and before I could look up, they began jumping. The paratroopers shoved each other so swiftly and heavily towards the open door that they jolted against the doorframe.
A few units landed intact, but most were broken up. Some troopers were lost for days, others for weeks. Some landed in farm fields flooded by Rommel. They drowned, pulled under by as much as 100 pounds of equipment. Then, the Allied planes, more than 1,000 of them dropping more than 1,700 tons of bombs. And before you could see the ships, the Armada opened up. The battleships Texas, Nevada, and Arkansas, and hundreds of others firing shell after shell after shell.
40 years ago, this became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American military history. This was Omaha Beach. It was the landing area for the 1st and 29th Divisions. And on that day, there was confusion and death all around.
Loaded with gear, weapons, fuel packs, winter uniforms, poison gas coveralls, crammed and bobbing in flat-bottom landing craft and heavy swells, nearly everyone was violently ill. Howard Marshall described the first wave.
We headed straight for our appointed portion of the beach, with our planes overhead giving us the sort of cover we'd been hoping for. The wind was driving the sea in with long rollers. And suddenly, as we tried to get between two of these Cowpart defense systems of the Germans, our craft swung, we touched a mine, there was a very loud explosion, and water began pouring in.
They came onto the beach, onto the mines, and under the steady fire of the German shore batteries and machine guns. Americans drowned. They were blown apart by mines, shredded by bullet and artillery fire. But they kept on coming until sheer numbers, 34,000 men on the first wave, 25,000 on the next tide, broke the German line. It took most of the day, but finally, Omaha Beach was secured.
When we come back, a look back with the men who were among the first ashore at Omaha Beach, punching a hole in Hitler's Atlantic Wall with the combat engineers, when Time and Again continues.
Good morning, everybody. We are told that an immense armada of upwards of 4,000 ships, together with several thousand smaller crafts, crossed the channel. That is indeed an enormous armada. We are told that 11,000 first-line warplanes are supporting the operation. 60,000 men carried across some 80 or 100 miles of channel into France.
The D-Day invasion was called Operation Overlord. The beaches of Normandy were also given names: Sword, Gold, Juno, Utah, and Omaha. All were difficult. Omaha Beach was hell on earth. Here's Brian Williams in 1994, just before the 50th anniversary of D-Day.
This is Omaha Beach on the windswept coast of Normandy, France. A rugged but pastoral French seaside of long beaches, strong tides, dunes, and high bluffs that 50 years ago was a killing zone by design. Here, Hitler had built his Atlantic Wall with French and slave labor from detention camps to keep the Allies out. Hardened and hidden artillery and gun emplacements, pillboxes, machine gun nests, some of it still visible today. 5 million mines were laid here, and obstacles designed to be impenetrable by landing craft and men stretched far offshore. Among the first troops to scramble down the cargo nets for the D-Day assault on Omaha Beach were the combat engineers, whose job it was to penetrate the Atlantic Wall. For those in the 29th Infantry Division, this was their first day in combat. Robert Stewart was a 36-year-old captain. As his landing craft hit the beach, he shook hands with the man next to him.
We shook hands, and I jumped, and he started to jump, and somebody measured him with a bullet, and it hit him right between the eyes as if you were measured it. Get deader than the doornail.
Offshore naval bombardment and bombing raids missed their mark, and the combat engineers paid the price. With the beaches covered in smoke from burning dunes, the first moments of combat were about organizing the confusion, survival, and heroism. As the morning tides rolled in, many soldiers braved strafing gunfire to save those wounded in the surf. Soldiers like Bob Stewart, who won a Silver Star.
We were told, even in our basic orders in the division, not to go out and try to rescue men, because we had men for that job. But it's hard to see a man die out there when he can be saved.
Saving their mission came next. It took organization under fire to reach their objective, destroy it, and open the road from the beach.
We started collecting men, TNT, got into that obstacle, and blew it about 2:30, and just blew the dickens out of it.
Hours behind schedule, the combat engineers cleared Omaha Beach for the invasion inland, but at what cost? After their first day in battle, of the 91 men Stewart and Hickman came ashore with, only 13 had not been killed, wounded, or captured. Many are buried near the beach, near the memorials here that mark their effort.
Men made some pretty good sacrifices to bear the integrity of this country. It should have increased the integrity of care for this country by the people that live here now. It's a never-ending process.
To sum up then, the invasion is well begun. The first operations have succeeded. It is going according to plan. The initial success has been greater than we anticipated.
Now, while we await further transmissions from overseas, we invite you to listen to the Star-Spangled Banner.
Those old enough to remember will remember. Those who were not missed something. A day 30 years ago when the American people were united as they seldom, if ever, have been since. It was the day of a tremendous invasion of a European continent occupied and controlled by a madman. The beginning of the end of a war the American people believed in, supported, took part in, and took pride in. And those who grew up in a generation of division, disunity, conflict, and crime, who can hardly imagine the American people being in full agreement on anything, making sacrifices willingly, feeling they were a part of something they believed in, may hope that sometime we'll see that again, preferably without a war. But whether or not we ever have it again, we had it once.
NBC's David Brinkley on June 6, 1974, the 30th anniversary of D-Day. One of the most remarkable things about D-Day was that even as the biggest invasion force in history was being assembled in Great Britain, Hitler was kept in the dark about where and when the Allies would strike.
A captured code machine was the biggest edge the Allies had. They used it to monitor German communications to find out what Hitler was thinking and planning. In 1944, 500,000 German troops were deployed in northwestern Europe. Keeping those guns away from the real D-Day landing zone involved intrigue and illusion. Fake radio transmissions from Scotland convinced the Germans that 250,000 British troops were massing there for an invasion of Norway. The Nazi army in northern France was tricked into expecting 500,000 American invaders to cross the English Channel at its narrowest point, 150 miles north of Normandy. That phantom force was to be led by the legendary General George Patton. National Geographic magazine unwittingly spread the myth by publishing division patches for the non-existent army. And there were props to fool German surveillance, hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks, and canvas airplanes that were built by a movie studio.
Despite the Allies' ingenuity and good fortune, plenty went wrong once the invasion actually got underway. The fog of war was thick on the beaches of Normandy. Historian Stephen Ambrose talked about that with Katie Couric on June 6, 1994.
Eisenhower used to say that in war, before the battle is joined, plans are everything. The minute the shooting starts, plans are worthless. And on this beach, more than any other place in the Second World War, that was absolutely the case. The men had been briefed to expect that all these German defenses would be blown to smithereens by the Air Force, and anything that the Air Force left, the Navy would take care of, and the tanks would come in beside them, and when their ramps went down, they get behind those tanks, and they go up these draws here. This bluff is too steep for tanks, but the draws. And then they were told, your battle will begin when you get up here on top. None of that happened. The Air Force bombardment was 2 and 3 and 4 kilometers inland because the pilots were afraid of hitting our incoming troops, so they delayed a fatal 2 seconds before dropping their bombs. The naval bombardment was too short in duration and too long in distance. And the swimming tanks that were to accompany the infantry ashore, 32 or 35 of them sank. So the infantry found themselves in a situation for which they had not in any way been prepared. They were pinned down at that seawall by murderous German fire coming off of this bluff and from the guns that are placed at each end of this beach.
Because they thought the soldiers on the front lines would be young, inexperienced, or older, not the 352nd.
That's
German
right. They were briefed
unit.
to expect a very second-rate or even third-rate German outfit here, and only a battalion. And in fact, there was a division, and they were very good troops. And they did a murderous job on the first waves. Company A of the 116th Infantry from Bedford, Virginia, took 96% casualties in the first 5 minutes without firing a shot.
I just want to ask you, I know for your book called D-Day, you interviewed hundreds.
Thousands.
300. Wow.
1,300.
So you've spoken to many, many people. Do they share a common bond? What struck you the most?
Their modesty. These guys are heroes. I mean, they're giants.
But they won't admit it.
No, they'll talk about the other guy. You should have seen him in action. And then I'll interview the other guy, and he'll say, you should have talked to him. He's the one who did it. It's their modesty above all else, and the feeling they have for their fallen comrades out here in this graveyard. I mean, these guys had come to love each other. They've been training together for 2 years for this operation. They knew how the other guy coughed. They knew how he smelled. They could recognize his silhouette in the dark. And they had a bond that no civilian can ever fully understand. And their feelings for their fallen comrades and their sense of why him and not me is what stands out above everything else.
D-Day was a day of heroes, and none had greater courage than the Army Rangers who took the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. We'll be back with their remarkable story in just a moment.
This is NBC News at this hour.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lori Stokes. News at this hour. So far, so good as far as the Y2K bug is concerned. Banks across the nation appear to have met the Y2K challenge, with ATMs turning out money without problems. Travel-related Y2K fears have also proven unfounded. Transportation Secretary Rodney Slater says that there have been no Y2K-related disruptions to highway traffic, air or rail service, and water and power are flowing without problem across the country. 8 power plants in the East and Midwest experienced a computer glitch, but power never went out, and the problem was quickly corrected. Well, the party's over. Now cleanup crews armed with sweepers, leaf blowers, and lots of brooms have taken over Times Square in New York. About 2 million revelers gathered there last night. In Boston, city workers are sweeping up confetti and other remnants from last night's festivities. Crowds in Beantown ring in the new year at 5 separate countdowns throughout the city. And the new year came up roses for thousands of partygoers in Pasadena, California at the annual Rose Parade. About 500,000 people camped out overnight along the 5.5-mile parade route. They were treated to 54 floats and 25 marching bands. University of Wisconsin and Stanford University go head-to-head at the Rose Bowl in a few minutes. Doctors in London say that they want to keep former Beatle George Harrison under observation through the weekend. Harrison is recovering from a stab wound to the chest and is in stable condition. He and his wife were attacked by an intruder in their home Thursday. Suspect has been charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. A wooden boat packed with nearly 300 Haitian immigrants ran aground near Miami early this morning. Coast Guard officials say about half of the boat's passengers have agreed to board Coast Guard vessels. It is believed the group may have been at sea for as many as 5 days. Under an agreement between the U.S. and Haiti, would-be immigrants are sent home once they are intercepted. And on his first full day in office, acting Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Russian forces in Chechnya, praising the troops. Putin said that the war in Chechnya was aimed at stemming the breakup of the Russian Federation. Putin was adamantly supported the war and had defended Russia against Western criticism of the offensive. Putin was named acting president after Boris Yeltsin's surprise resignation yesterday. And those are the headlines for you at this hour. I'm Lori Stokes. Our next update in just about an hour. Time and again, a look back at D-Day continues in just a moment.
This program will be interrupted from time to time to bring you the latest news bulletins as they are received in the newsroom. Keep tuned to your favorite NBC station to keep in step with all the latest developments on this Invasion Day.
Welcome back to Time and Again. In the spring of 1944, virtually all of Europe was in Adolf Hitler's grip. Great Britain was the exception, and it had been endlessly pounded by Nazi bombing. If the Allies were to stop Hitler, they first had to get a foothold in France. The Nazis had occupied that country since 1940, plenty of time to turn it into a fortress. The most dangerous and difficult mission on D-Day, to destroy part of that fortress. 5 big Nazi guns at Pointe du Hoc.
The majestic cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, halfway between Omaha and Utah beaches, it was thought to hold the key to the invasion's success. The men assigned to take the point and destroy 5 German guns mounted there were the Rangers, an all-volunteer fighting force. Lynn Lamel was First Sergeant of D Company, 2nd Battalion.
These are elite forces. These are 500 men per battalion. Our battalion, for example, 2nd Battalion, we screened 2,000 men to get our 500.
On the evening of June the 5th, they set sail for Pointe du Hoc. As they approached the cliffs, emotions ran high.
There were high seas that morning. It was raining, it was cold, and we were nervous. And I will never forget the feeling came over me when I looked up and I saw a German kneeling, aiming down at us. I'm sure, I feel certain he was aiming at me. And I thought, someone is actually trying to kill me. And I wasn't able to shoot back because we had to get up the cliffs.
When I stepped off the ramp of my landing crab, I was the first one shot. I was machine gunned through the right side, went right through the muscle and flesh, didn't hit any bones or important organs. It didn't bother me that much.
When I started up the cliffs, it was difficult because it had rained, and these were clay cliffs, and our roofs were just like grease. I got to the very top, and we made our way over to where the gun emplacements were to find that the guns were gone.
Lamel and Kuhn went on a 2-man patrol to search for the guns.
It's so far out of character for Len Lamel to cuss. Matter of fact, I don't think I ever heard him utter a cuss word except once. And that's when we were going down this dirt road looking for the possibility the guns may be down there. And I heard Len say, "Jack, Here's those goddamn guns.
5 guns in perfect working condition stood ready for action, but no one was guarding them. After placing grenades on the weapons, they moved away. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion.
We were the only mission on D-Day that was accomplished, and the first to be accomplished. But I don't think of myself as a hero. We knew the value of the mission, and we did it.
Do you ever wonder, thinking back on it, what would have happened had you not stumbled upon those gun positions?
What would have happened? They would have killed tens of thousands of Americans on the beaches of Omaha, Utah, and English beaches. They would have probably sunk hundreds, if not thousands, of the ships at sea. We knew among ourselves that we were going to die. If it took us to the last man, we were going to get those guns and prevent them firing from any ship or on any beach on that D-Day invasion.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion: to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. Behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Puente Hope. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war.
We are the children of your sacrifice. We are the sons and daughters you saved from tyranny's reach. We grew up behind the shield of the strong alliances you forged in blood upon these beaches, on the shores of the Pacific, and in the skies above. We flourished in the nation you came home to build. The most difficult days of your lives bought us 50 years of freedom. You did your job. Now we must do ours.
They were less complicated times. Americans marched off to battle as if they had a God-given right to win. And indeed, looking back across those Normandy beaches, whether it was destiny or just good luck, on D-Day, the brakes did fall to the Allies. There was the weather, the German intelligence failures, the infighting among Hitler's officers, all of which benefited the Allied commanders. And there was the incredible stroke of fortune that in Normandy on D-Day, one German general was not there, Erwin Rommel, his country's most respected officer, a man who had repeatedly outwitted the Allies with a minimum of resources. Hitler chose Rommel to defend the most vulnerable part of his empire, the coast of France. And one resource Rommel now wanted was Panzer tank divisions, ready to strike the moment the inevitable Allied invasion began. In early June, as bad weather moved in, the normally cautious Rommel judged it safe to briefly return to Germany to confront Hitler about the Panzers, stopping at home to celebrate his wife's birthday. He couldn't have known he was leaving his post less than a day and a half before the invasion was to begin. Rommel's son believes today that if his father had been at the front, he could have organized stronger opposition.
He could have made special efforts to achieve the permission of Hitler to move the tank divisions. If successful, nobody knows.
Manfred Rommel in 1984, son of one of Hitler's most feared, most respected generals. Could Erwin Rommel have prevailed on D-Day? His son was asked that question again 10 years later.
If your father had had the forces that he'd asked for from Berlin, if he'd have had those Panzer divisions under his control as he'd wanted, if he'd been at his headquarters on 6th of June, 44, did he think the outcome may have been different?
I think no, and I think my father would have given the same answer. The British and Americans were too, and the French were too strong, and the strategy of this battle was too clever, and the war, maybe it would have taken some weeks longer before the German front was penetrated. And by the way, today we know that it was better to lose a war than to win it with Hitler.
Is it true that he thought Hitler had, I think the words were, the military competence of a sergeant?
No. My father believed that Hitler has a gift of touching the important points, the essential points. Of course, Hitler was a dilettante, but and he was a completely immoral person. He had no morals at all.
On June 6, 1994, the 50th anniversary of D-Day, German government leaders were excluded from the ceremonies at Normandy. But many German veterans did attend, wanting to make amends before time ran out. NBC's Keith Miller told the story of one of them.
He has spent the past 50 years trying to forget the war and the Allied invasion that helped to end it. Reinhold Schmidt, 69, returned to Normandy with other German veterans to remember and make friends with an old enemy.
We want to speak with the Allied veterans for peace.
Schmidt's 6th Parachute Regiment fought one of the bloodiest battles of Normandy against the American 90th Infantry Division at Utah Beach.
You could feel the power. You could see the Air Force. I saw the warships. I thought, what's this?
The Germans lost 500,000 dead or missing trying to repel the invasion. Of the 140 men in Schmidt's unit, he is one of 3 to have survived the battle. American veterans of the 90th Infantry honored the German dead at a cemetery where more than 20,000 Germans are buried. Schmidt's regiment is respected by the GIs because they honored a ceasefire so wounded Americans could be evacuated. The gesture has never been forgotten.
Today we are friends.
In the village of Perrier, a few miles from where they fought against each other, they gathered to remember. And they found it possible to come together.
We have done a hard fight. Never happened again.
It takes courage to forgive, especially when the memories of Normandy are so painful on all sides, even after 50 years.
On this date in 1944, this country and the rest of the world stopped and held its breath and listened to the radio. The greatest military operation in history had begun landing American, British, and Canadian troops on the beaches of Normandy on their way across Europe to destroy Adolf Hitler. Had it failed, nobody knows what kind of world it would be today.
NBC's David Brinkley in 1979, marking D-Day's 35th anniversary. The young men who survived the Normandy invasion are old men now, passing into history. Over the years, many have shared their memories with NBC News. Here's what some of them had to say.
I celebrated my 20th birthday sitting in the channel 2 days before the invasion. And at that time I was 20 and immortal, so it didn't matter to me. I knew we could do it, so when we got the order to go in, we simply went in. There was no doubt in our mind what we could do or couldn't do.
I just kept going. I tell you, it was like God was with me. The bullets were bursting in front of me, and if the timing was off, I would have been there.
The most important thing everybody was looking for was one word. It's the most beautiful word ever invented. It's called cover.
Well, I think we remember the pain. It becomes sadder. I think we become more sentimental. I think we cry easier now than we did in them days because of the memory of all the fellows that died here. And we find it very, very painful to remember a lot of these things. What makes it nice to be back is a warm reception, and somebody appreciates what we actually done. I'm amazed that somebody cares about us. Back home, they could care less.
Putting your life in the guy's hands that's next to you in the foxhole, and he's doing the same to you, putting his life in his hands, and really is an experience that you'll never forget. There's a comradeship there that you never will forget.
I didn't expect that. Caught me off guard there. It makes you think of a lot of things that happened 50 years ago. After 50 years, you would expect them to be kind of buried a little more deeply.
War is hell. And, unfortunately, that's how we live. In every generation, there's been war. That's part of nature. And I hate it.
Everything that the men had been promised turned out to be not true. The Air Force hadn't done its job, the Navy hadn't done its job, and the men of the 29th and 1st Divisions at Omaha Beach came off those landing craft into a hail of steel and lead, the likes of which has seldom been seen on this earth. There were dead men floating in the water, and there were live men letting the tide take them in. What you had there at Omaha Beach was a disorganized mob of exhausted men. There wasn't any going up the draws behind the tanks. The tanks weren't there. They had to fight their way up that bluff. And they did it. And it was one of the great feats of arms of American, and indeed of all military history. It was young American kids assuming the responsibility and getting the job done.
Thousands of Allied soldiers, most of them Americans, died on D-Day. They are buried on the bluffs of Normandy, near the beaches where they came ashore and gave their all on June 6, 1944.
The headstones of the cemetery tell only the basics, just the particulars of men long gone but not forgotten. Men whose pictures, letters, and history flesh out portraits of typical Americans asked to show atypical bravery. The Americans who fought on D-Day were both brave and frightened, confident but still confused. They were, in the main, men like Lieutenant Robert Bryce, who joined the Rangers and became a platoon leader, even though he was initially opposed to the war. By D-Day, he still had his doubts. In his last letter home, he wrote, "How England expects to force a beachhead on the continent of Europe, dominated by the greatest military machine in the history of the world, only heaven knows." His landing craft headed for Omaha Beach at about 10:30 on the morning of D-Day, but Bryce never made it. He was shot wading ashore. He was just 22 years old. Colonel James Bender was nicknamed the Chief, a tribute to his Native American ancestors. He was 47 when he died on D-Day, killed by a machine gun. On the day before he died, he wrote to his young son and outlined his principles of honesty, energy, thrift, and pride, and closed with the words, "I hope it won't be too long before we can all be together again. I am fine and proud to have such a fine son." Private First Class Henry Kruzik was the 10th and youngest child born to a farm family in St. Charles, Michigan. When he was wounded on Omaha Beach, his wounds were treated, and he was asked to stay put until further help arrived. By the time someone came back for him, he was dead, shot through the head. His parents learned of his death in a letter from the War Department. The letter from the Secretary of War arrived with a posthumous Purple Heart and came to Mr. and Mrs. Stanley Kruzik on what would have been their son's 27th birthday. Among the 9,386 headstones of the Normandy Cemetery are 307 which are marked unknown for those soldiers whose remains could not be identified. Here, too, are 3 Congressional Medal of Honor winners, 1 son of a president, and 33 pairs of brothers. The Hoback brothers of Bedford, Virginia were among about 30 men from Bedford's National Guard unit to hit Omaha Beach in the first wave. Of those 30, 23 were killed, including Bedford Hoback and his brother Raymond. Bedford was killed instantly when he was hit by a mortar. Raymond was wounded and hauled to relative safety at what his friends thought was the high tide line. It wasn't. When his friends returned, all that was left where Raymond had been was a plastic-wrapped Bible with his mother's address. The family still has that Bible.